All right. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Keep It Real Conversations. Once again, pray that you had a great weekend, that you've enjoyed this wonderful, wonderful weather that we've been having here on the East Coast the past few days, and that you had a great Monday, the start of a new work week. Uh, I had put out there, last week I was going to do a random thoughts Monday, and in a sense, this will still be a random thoughts because I still want to hear what people are thinking, but could not ignore the fact of the big headlines of the day being that of Queen Elizabeth II's funeral service. I was able to watch much of it. I got up early because I had to go into work. I usually don't go to work. I usually tell work on Mondays, but I had to go in for a class this morning. So I was up early just in time to see them doing the processional in and everything like that. And then was able to check in from time to time while I was at work just to see where they were at in the arrangements. I found it very interesting. I knew it was going to be interesting. There's those of us who like the pomp and circumstance of it all. I by no means am a Anglophile or anything like that. I don't try to keep up with the royals or anything, but it's kind of hard, whether you're an Anglophile or not. It's kind of hard to ignore what's been going on the past 10 days. And just my personal thought, and I do have two wonderful guests I'm going to bring in momentarily. Just my personal thought, when I heard about the Queen, I mean, I'm old, but I'm not that old. She's been queen longer than I've been living. And I would think for most of us, she's been queen longer than most of us or many of us have been living. And in a sense, there was a sense of loss for me, but at the same time, it's not like I felt like there was a great loss, and I don't want to say necessarily that I'm indifferent of it, but I will say that it did strike a chord with me because the world is going to be different, and I started thinking the other day, um, you know. I knew I was going to talk about this, but I was going to talk about a whole lot of other things as well. One thing, and we may still be able to talk about this because both of these young ladies are very versed in what they do and in their knowledge of what we're going to be talking about. Um, was the other thing I was going to talk about was the whole immigrants being shipped to um, what was it? He flew on. DeSantis flew them up to the vineyard. It'll come to me. Y'all know what I'm talking about. It's been in the news. So I was thinking about that, and I was thinking about some other things I wanted to talk about. Some of it's silly, some of it not so silly. But then I really thought, I might as well be like everybody else and talk about the Queen for a few moments, and that's why I invited these two ladies. So um, the first I want to introduce you to is Grace Jabril. Hey, Grace.
Hi, how are you?
I know Grace. She was a former supervisor of mine, um, and we struck up a friendship as well. And if you want to talk about Kenya pride, she is the embodiment of Kenya. And I thought about her because there's a lot of countries that were once a part of this um,
Yeah, Mama,
monarch or
the
this.
colonialism.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and Kenya was a part of it. They did become independent
Yeah.
um, in 1963.
Hmm.
Uh, but still, I just kind of wanted to see what that was all about. And then in our talkings in the past, Grace let me know or talked to me about her sister, and I'm gonna bring her in. And that's Dr. Catherine Adoya.
Hello.
And I thank you for joining as well. It's the first time we've had an opportunity to talk, even though we've heard good things about each other, hopefully, um, over the past few years as well. Um, I'll tell you what, just give us a little bit of a background about who you are. Grace, tell us about who you are, what you do, you know, go as deep or as light as you like.
Sure. So I have a profession in human resources, concentration, and employment law, and of course, it was absolutely fantastic working with you, Mark. And I miss you dearly. I miss the team over there, the staff. Um, the other component of all this is for many years I did. across global, um, I guess, events that linked small businesses with larger businesses, pseudo political events, one being the inauguration of Barack Obama that was organized by the Africans in the United States. It's called inaugurate. It was what is it? Africa on the Potomac, and one in 2013 also. So we were very successful. Did a 1,000-person event that had the Deputy Secretary of African Affairs. It had the ambassador to Kenya, the ambassador to Tanzania, the ambassador to Uganda, and pretty much all the East African ambassador diplomatic corps, and lots and lots of political folks from Kenya. In addition to a lot of churches were participating, both in 2009 and 2013. So that's kind of was one of the it was one of the biggest events I'd had, along with other different conferences that I started doing since pretty much 1999. There were part-time gigs. I've always kind of stayed involved in Africa, or African events, and I've been lucky enough to start my career in organizations that work in Africa to essentially help in development and international development, things like that. So, but
Okay.
human resources has been my passion.
Good. And you, Dr. Catherine?
Thank you so much for having me, Mark. It's such a pleasure to be here in your company and with my sister Gracie, because I've heard so much about you. I've heard so much about the work that you do, about this podcast, about all the other projects that you're so creatively involved in, that I'm inspired
Oh,
and honored to have been invited to come and speak with you here.
thank you.
I think maybe the most meaningful thing I can share about myself at the moment, because I can imagine that during the conversation we'll get to know each other better. But the most meaningful thing I can share about myself right now is that from a very young age, I have enjoyed reading. I love literature, and I found in it joy, adventure, query, confusion, but also guidance in ways that were really unexpected for me. And Gracie can probably relate to this. When I was 9 years old in our boarding school, I set up a lending library in my dormitory because
Wow.
I was so in love with the idea of reading and books that I wanted to make it part of a shared experience with others. And so, in my 9-year-old mind, the way to do that was to go and collect all the random books that were lying around on our campus and create. And then I got permission from our house mistress to basically claim a cabinet in a storage room. And I told all my other dormitory mates that the lending library was open. All this to say that in literature, I find the story of our shared human experiences, and 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 while I don't know what the future holds for any of us, really, what I do know is that in this repository, in the shared legacy that we all have in literature, there's also, I think, a chance to connect with the better angels of our nature, for lack of a better word. I'm reminded of a passage from the Corinthians, the very beginning of First Corinthians, chapter 13, that very famous um, section of the New Testament that says, "If I speak in the tongues of men or of angels, but do not have love, I am only a resounding gong or a clanging cymbal.
Right.
If I have the gift of prophecy and can fathom all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have a faith that can move mountains, but do not have love, I am nothing. If I give all I possess to the poor and give over my body to hardship that I may boast, but do not have love, I gain nothing." I quote this simply to say that while my life has been spent cultivating knowledge and understanding through literature and books, through listening to people smarter and wiser than me, trying to make sense of the world that we live in, the truth always comes down to, without that real human connection where we're talking to one another as brother and sister wherever we may go, then all of that splendor means nothing.
Hmm.
All the wealth in the world means nothing. All the power in the world means nothing. All of the brains and credentials really don't mean very much
Absolutely.
in the face of the absence of love. So, so in the spirit of love and and fraternity, I thank you very much for inviting me to come and speak with you today.
Oh, thank you. That was well said. That's one of the better introductions I've heard. Um, I appreciate that. So let's jump right into this Queen Elizabeth II.
Mhm.
Have either of you lived in England for any amount of time?
We traveled back and forth through it on our way to the U.S.
Okay.
But I think Kathy spent more time in London than I have.
I
Okay.
have. So I spent time there when I was an undergraduate because I was in an education abroad program that took me through Italy and Spain and Portugal primarily, and to some extent France. And so I would take the opportunity to spend as much time I could, especially in southern England, basically London and south thereof, because it was easy back then. I can't believe I
Right.
just said back
Right.
then. It was
Even in
easy to
London.
really cross borders once you had especially a student visa that allowed you to go through all the Schengen countries. In the post-Brexit world, I think things are a little bit more complicated. But
And could you
but I
explain Brexit to the audience? Explain Brexit to the audience real quick, just so they get a
oh
context.
sure sure. Okay, so you're gonna get the Adoyo version of Brexit for a second
Okay.
here, but I welcome everyone to go and educate yourself. Go find some reliable information, especially from encyclopedias like the Encyclopedia Britannica or other more reliable sources that are not just editorial. So, my version of Brexit is that in 1066, this was about 1,000 years ago, just shy of 1,000 years ago. So, 44 years shy of 1,000 years ago, when the King of England, Edward II, died, he left his throne to a young, I think, a grandnephew who was born in France, William. So the Duke of Normandy. William comes and claims the throne and takes it by force because some people are trying to prevent him from doing that. And in doing so, having been born and raised in France, in Normandy, William brings with him his court, his people. For 500 years after William's arrival in 1066, the royal court of England is a French speaking place. So the official language of the royal court was French for 500 years, from
Right.
1066 to around the 1500s. The 1500s come around, there's a lot of roiling and boiling going on, right? But because of succession wars and conflicts, the family that ends up taking over from from William's line that had been essentially ruling uninterrupted for 500 years is the first non-French born kings. These are the Tudor kings. So the Tudors take over in the early 1500s or the late 1400s. I don't quite have my dates set there,
That's fine.
but the Tudors take over, and in a sense that became sort of their reclaiming in England back, if you will, from the interlopers from across the channel. Because imagine 500 years, all the English kings were born in France and then brought to the throne, and it was time for them to inherit. But now you have a homegrown island born or British Isles born king taking over. And then the series of kings after that, they all tend to be born of the British Isles. So I've skipped 500 years in both, just letting
That's
you know
fine.
that
Mm-hmm.
1,000 years ago, the continent, the European continent, and the British Isles basically got bridged by the advent of William the Conqueror to the throne. This is where my story of Brexit begins, because the idea that it creates, also in terms of the sense of shared history that Europeans have on the continent, but also with the British, is tied into a lot of myths and legends and what have you, that tie in figures like Charlemagne and, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So fast forward, and we are on the cusp of we are in the beginning of the third millennium, the 2000s. And there's all this noise about Britain wanting to break off from Europe. I think in the popular imagination, it seems just a recent history that Britain and Europe were sort of bridged together, but
Right.
it's a much deeper running history. Like I said, it's a history that dates all the way back 1,000 years. So from my perspective, I watched this with a great deal of anticipation, going, oh my God, what's going to happen? Are they
Mm.
actually going to break this 1,000-year bridge that has existed between the continent and the British Isles via the Channel with France? And indeed they did. And in the process, some of the procedural formality of it meant that whereas before in the modern Europe, where England or Britain, or United Kingdom, let me put it that way, the modern world where the United Kingdom and the Schengen countries, basically the European Union, recognized one another in, I think, in a fairly amicable,
Equal. Mhm.
both economic and international relationship,
Mhm.
which allowed for them to have porous borders, right? So Europe today, the European Union today, and countries of the European Union, especially those that are categorized as Schengen countries, enjoy the privilege of having very porous borders, and residents and citizens of these countries can move quite freely within them. And this was a privilege that was extended to the United Kingdom until Brexit happened, because Brexit was a referendum or an initiative that was started by, I believe, the Conservatives
Yep.
in the United Kingdom, who no longer wanted to participate in this kind of relationship with Europe. They wanted to, first of all, seal those porous borders and define more cleanly the national differences between the United Kingdom and Europe. They wanted to put into place stricter regulations for movement, not only of people but of goods. I think they framed this very much as a cultural preservation initiative, but also
Mhm.
um, an economic, uh, um, an economic preservation initiative, and they apparently were very successful in selling it to the British voters. Okay, so fast forward again now a few months, a couple of years, and the news from across the pond is that many people on the ground are feeling the sting
It's the
of the
it's
success of Brexit, in
it's
that where they were
the
so used to the privileges of porous borders, of being able to move freely, of being able to move goods freely, they're now faced with the reality of what it means to have to not only pay tariffs, but also to have to wait for the sheer bureaucracy of moving across the channel.
Mhm.
Things like trucking, the trucking industry is incredibly backed up. Just the traffic between France and England right now across the channel is unmanageable. I don't know what exactly is happening with the tunnel, the Channel Tunnel,
Yeah, it's
which
just
is a
back up.
very, very, very easy connection. But it would be interesting to find out what effect Brexit has had, because now the customs
Duty, the cost.
restrictions
Mhm.
of people moving between Waterloo Station and Paris Gare du Nord, which is where the train goes back and forth between. That must be a real customs nightmare. So,
Yeah, and
um,
the cost
but,
of
So
but here I entered the zone of speculation, and it's very, very interesting to see.
so let me ask you this, because I know, and please everyone,
Uh-huh.
Phil, please ask a question in the comment section if you want to ask a question,
Sure.
or if you want to give a comment, please put a comment in, and I'll also put up the phone number that you can call in as well if you want to ask either of these ladies a question directly. But so is Brexit in any way, because and I'm just kind of thinking about focusing on the recent events of the past 10 days or so, and
Yeah.
you're hearing over, well, how is the now King Charles, how is he going to handle things in these countries? And there are these countries that want to splinter off now and things like that. Do those things tie into Brexit, or is that completely different?
That's actually completely different. What you're referring to are the colonial, the what they call the British Protectorate countries, or what they call the Commonwealth nations. And most of those of you who follow sports have seen the Commonwealth Games in terms of track and field.
Okay.
It's usually on NBC. You always see the runners from Europe, the islands. It used to be Barbados, Jamaica, Trinidad,
Right.
all these countries that used to have the under British colonial powers, Kenya, South Africa. You know, you see a lot of countries, Nigeria, in terms of running, elite running levels. Of course, there's many other British protectorate countries,
Right.
but those countries, especially those in the Caribbean, are starting to rethink, as Barbados did. The Prime Minister of Barbados, if you guys follow the news, about 3 months ago, if not 4 months ago, declared that Barbados would no longer be a British protectorate and would be leaving the Commonwealth. And there was an entire procession. You guys who follow Rihanna saw Rihanna going back to Barbados and speaking at that event, along with the Prime Minister. And Prince Charles, at the time, was present for the handing over of the protectorate back to the
Okay.
Barbados people of Barbados. So what's essentially happening now? You're seeing Jamaica, you're seeing Grenada. You're seeing a lot of, I think Grenada's French, excuse me. You're seeing Trinidad, a few other countries that are former British colonies saying that they're not interested in being in the Commonwealth. I haven't quite heard from the African countries yet, but you do have countries like South Africa. Julius Malema specifically, he's an activist, but he's also a politician, and you hear him. He's one of the people who's leading the fight to return the diamond, North Star, I think, Kathy, right?
Right.
North Star,
Right.
back to South Africa, and then the Indians jumped on that also, and were asking for, I think, a ruby. Kathy, do you remember? I think it was a ruby
Yes.
that was mined, and there's a whole other history that we might have to be another show, because the history between the royal families, which is I think what we're getting at here in this show, the former colonies, and the depths in which there were losses, and the subsequent underdevelopment of those
Right.
nations, and the way in which the IMF and the World Bank, these are called Bretton Woods institutions, have artificially deflated currencies in these countries. So when most of the audience members, yes or no, look at Africa, and they look at sometimes the Caribbean, specifically even Haiti, they think, man, these Black folks can't get it together, or these people have, their countries, they can't even get stuff together. What people don't know is that between the Cold War and between the artificial deflation of their values of the reduction, or the artificial reduction of the values of their currencies, in addition to the development dollars in exchange for underdevelopment, which breeds corruption.
Right.
Uh, and when I say underdevelopment, I say, well, Ghana has probably the largest production of cocoa. I think Ghana and Ivory Coast, and yet there's not a single refinery in Ghana that makes chocolate. I think they just started one maybe 10 years ago.
Right.
But all this time, you and I and everybody else, we know, but other people have been thinking that it's Swiss chocolate, it's Belgian chocolate. They have no idea these things are coming out of Africa.
Right.
You see, the chocolate we eat, Nestle, all these guys. And that's part of that what we call modern or neo-colonialistic practices that are ongoing, that were sort of based on the original colonialism, and ways in which these colonial powers could maintain control over the former colonies, to things like, Commonwealth, protectorates, and France, and its whole control of the former French colonies. But I'll pass it on to Catherine.
So I think this kind of where I want to go, in a sense that, well, one, and like I said, I'm not an Anglophile or anything like that. And, we've been hearing Brexit over the years, many years now. We know something, I believe many of us, when I say us, many Americans, we've heard it, but we don't really understand it. I don't think we understand really the difference between, the United Kingdom versus, the European connections and all that. I don't think we really grasp all of that. That's kind of why I wanted to kind of talk to you as well, because I knew that you have some insight on that. But also, like I said, with the past 10 days, the whole issue of, because if you look at media alone, it makes it look like the world loves or loved Queen Elizabeth.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that not to be true.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I know, like I said, in 63, Kenya became independent. But what's your sense? How do you think Kenyans are perceiving this most
Ken-
recently?
One thing about Kenyans as a people is that just as the British and most Western nations have done, uh, one thing I can say is Kenyans took from the British what they felt was useful and useful. That's the only word I can use. So you're finding that when you talk about the Queen, there's a little bit of a class structure in terms of upper class people. Of course, you find are very British in their accents, the
Hmm.
proper speaking. Then you've got guys like me and Kathy who sort of grew up in the middle, up kind of a little bit upper middle class. Um, but we even in our boarding schools, there was just like you could tell where the big families came from. But what's beautiful about our school is the big families were mostly the farming families. I mean, the guys who ran most of the farming in Kenya and were part of the breadbasket. So
Okay.
they didn't have that highfalutin accent stuff. That's really concentrated in Nairobi and a little bit of the eastern coast. But there is some classism, just as there is. The only other place I see that present is Jamaica, where you find in Jamaica a lot of the folks are speaking really proper English and British English, and they're inculcated with the British culture. Bermuda also has that. So it's almost like some of the protectorates or the former colonies took things that they felt would, make them give them a nice little fit to the culture. But what is unique about Kenya is, in as much as they have this elitism in some class level, there's a deep sense of nationalism about being an African and being an African Kenyan and being a person who is very serious about what they do. Kenyans are not like myself. You've gotten to know me. I'm really silly. I like to laugh. I really like humor. That kind of stuff would not be looked at very well in Kenya. And that's a very British type of thinking sense of being. And it could be culturally Kenyan too, but I'm just using similarities, I guess. The other thing is, one of the things Kenya has done well is partner in terms of military strategies because of some of the issues we've had in terms of terrorism and things like that. They've leaned on their role or their image or their position as a British protectorate to get dollars or pounds in to buttress their military spending, right? Including weapons and things like that. But culturally, you will find that there is a little bit of enlightenment. One of the things about the advent of, I want to just segue 1 second, hip hop, gospel music, and the African American culture, because it's there. It's actually, and it's spread across the globe. You're finding that with that came the stories of the African Americans in terms of uh, things, slavery,
Hmm.
the Middle Passage, things like that. That by default created a curiosity, of course, with the advent of social media, created a curiosity that, wait a minute, you mean these guys went through this? We always thought they were just Black folks in America, and they're pretty much like white people living in this amazing America.
Wow.
No one in a lot of places in Africa knew the story of African Americans until I think 20, 25 years ago, guys. And with
Wow.
the advent of social media, the YouTubes of the world, and the Googles and the Facebooks of the world, you started seeing stories of the African American come through. And with that, guys like, Kirk Franklin, BB and CC, you started seeing a growth in the churches and the what sorry, I forget the sorry, not the Pentecostal, the churches, the modern churches now as we see them, not the Catholic or Protestant. as
Right.
a term. Yeah. You saw growth in a lot of the evangelical churches. And you also kind of started seeing a bit of a push away from the Anglican Church, which is the most powerful in at least East Africa. Catholicism is strong in Africa, and the Anglican religion has been strong in Africa. And it's because of colonialism and the belief that this is where, the West is where the concept of the church came from. But then with the advent of social media, guys are like, wait, you mean Ethiopia was an Orthodox church, and you mean there were all kinds of other traditional churches? You mean the practices that the royal family is doing right now, doing the rites, the long walk, as they call for the queen?
Right.
You mean these are the same as our chiefs and our kings used to do when someone died, sacrificing a lamb? Those were called pagan practices. Wait a minute.
Right.
Wait a
Right.
minute. So, and it's funny. That's kind of what everybody's starting to understand, that, culture is a lot more complicated and not just white or black. It's what your ancestors practiced, inculcated into whatever modern times they were at the time, brought all the way to the 21st century. And
Yeah.
that's what you're seeing in Africa. So there are people who, understood, like Queen Elizabeth became queen in Kenya. People don't know that. She got word of King George's passing while
Yeah.
she was
Yeah.
in Kenya.
Yeah.
Many don't know that. So Kenyans have been kind of proud, like, she became queen here. So, you know what I'm saying? We're going to take credit for that. So
Right.
it's that kind
Well, I
of
was going to say the most recent Kenya president. I think he's only been in involved office a couple of
me
weeks
too.
now.
Yeah.
He
Yes.
actually went to the service,
Yes.
and I was wondering how was that received. Um,
Yeah.
I mean,
And mhm.
what is she considered to be beloved?
It's I don't want to say beloved, but respected.
Okay.
One of the things about one of the similarities that African countries have taken from these Western royals, specifically the most famous ones, which is the British royals, is the fact that we also had chieftainships and kingships in Africa. So the default mode is respect,
Right.
respect.
Okay.
You don't you hear some folks out of Nigeria saying some real truthful things that are very hurtful and inappropriate, as some
But
people
it's
feel.
truthful.
But it's truthful, you see. But folks are getting really angry, like it's some new thing. Us guys in Africa, we're like, yeah, that's kind of been what we've been saying all along. Like our artifacts are at the British Museum. When are we kind of going to get them back?
Yeah. I've been
And
hearing that for
wait,
many, many, many years.
yeah, there's a woman
Um,
in Kenya. She's part of the Kikuyu tribe. She was there when the British were torturing Kenyans during the Mau Mau insurrection, during the battle for independence. And
right.
what's interesting about the battle of independence, it features directly with the civil rights movement, the African American civil rights movement. It was the African American civil rights movement was the flame that shone the light of freedom across the entire globe, specifically Africa.
Yeah.
Kwame Nkrumah was meeting with MLK. He was meeting with Thurgood Marshall. So you'll find in many African countries, Thurgood Marshall wrote their constitution. People don't know this. There's a lot in Africa that people don't know that is so correlated with Africans. What is so unique about Kenya is that Kenyans have a large, quiet, but a large group, not as big as Ghana, of African Americans living there. The East African environment, because of its development and the lack of war, especially in Kenya, and the lack of coups and instability, has made Kenya kind of the place to go. But with regards to the Queen, there is a sense of respect. You don't talk ill about the dead. It's a big thing in Kenya. No matter what's happened, you just don't talk ill about the dead, but you do quietly, diplomatically bring up issues after the fact. So I do expect countries will come apart, but I doubt Kenya will because of the strategic meaning. There's a strategic relationship that Kenya has with Great Britain or the UK, and meaning UK meaning Scotland, Ireland, of course, Britain, right? I think Kathy,
Right.
right? And they have a strategic partnership that I don't think they're going to let go of because it's to their advantage and to their benefit. Go ahead, Kathy.
I'd like to draw attention back to the original question that Mark asked, which is about attitudes toward the Queen.
Or
And
just again for the royal family in general.
sure. I think much of what Grace said applies and is informing, or is sort of inspired. So I'm sort of basically following up on what Grace has said on the subject. The thing that I want to focus on, however, is how the story of the relationship of the British Empire is framed to those peoples, including Kenyans, um, based on, like, whose interest does it serve? Um, whose interest is served by the way the story of the history of the British Empire is framed? It depends on your perspective.
Yeah.
From the dominant, what one would call, say, the hegemonic cultural perspective, meaning from the perspective of those in a position of both political, and internationally political and economic power, which is the European powers, the United States, a lot of the large Western nations. From that perspective, it is most useful for them to frame the story of British colonialism as a benevolent
Mm.
enterprise, as something that benefited the colonized, brought to them things like civilization and religion, salvation in Christianity, and what have you. And so this is the way that history is generally taught, even in Kenya. And we grew up in a place that had I think, a very benevolent attitude toward uh, Britain, toward the United Kingdom, at a cultural sort of grassroots roots level. So when you're talking to the people on the street, there isn't sort of a any sense of animosity or rancor or conflict really with it, because we are fed with mother's milk the story of this relationship of colonizer and colonized, but in a very I think, sanitized, Baudelarized version. We
Mm.
learn about the intrepid explorers. There's a textbook, this always makes me laugh. There's a textbook that I believe I read it here in the United States. I don't think it was available in Kenya or in Africa for that matter, but it was an American textbook that had this passage, which I will never forget. It said, until the Englishman ventured into the African jungle to discover the source of
Yeah.
the Nile, no man had ever seen this wonder of nature. And it
Mm.
cracked me up because
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
remember thinking to myself, really? And like, nobody?
Yeah.
Like, not a single
How
person?
about me? How about me and Kathy's great grandfather? That's kind of
So,
where our
so,
tribe is from. Are
so,
you
so,
serious? Like
Yeah.
so,
really?
so, so this is an area. I mean, the source of the Nile is in East Africa. It is quite specifically in Uganda, in a very heavily forested area, and it's beautiful. I mean, beautiful. That source it actually drains a large watershed in that central area of Africa, and then it makes its way north. The Nile being a uniquely odd phenomenon in that I believe it's the longest river that runs north.
Yeah.
Right.
So on the map, it looks like it's going upside down, right? Or it looks like it's rising as opposed to flowing
Right.
down, as you'd expect rivers to do. But I remember reading this passage, and I was quite young when I read it. Gracie, was early when we were in this country. So I was maybe, I don't know, 14, 15 maybe. And it was, for me, it was the beginning of starting to wonder about how stories are framed.
Right.
It was for
And
me
who gets to frame them?
yes, an awakening that not only was the world learning a particular kind of story about us, even passively and by chance, um, the story that they were learning wasn't one that was told by us. And then the follow up question was, what kind of story would we tell instead? And then that reminded me that our history books also celebrated Livingston and Richard Speake and all these
Mhm.
British quote unquote explorers who discovered all these places where we're from.
Right.
Um, it's there's something that happens in your mind when you begin to unlearn
Yeah.
the frames that have imposed upon you, especially a diminishing conception of who you are.
Right.
When you're framed and put into a box that tells you you are this small, when you begin to question that, you are essentially questioning yourself and everything you know about yourself.
Right.
It's not just as easy as saying, no, I'm not this small, I'm going to break out of this box. No, because if the box is what you know, you are endeavoring to destroy your entire world in order to discover who you really are, because you're rejecting the story that has been fed you all your life.
Right.
So
Right.
for me, this is where the journey begins. And I think it's a journey that many young Africans take quite early on, but it's a journey, I think, fraught with a great deal of uncertainty and a lot of gaps, a lot of chasms, if you will, that we can't quite cross because the language, the story, the experience to cross those chasms of knowledge and understanding just haven't been established. So
Right.
you have a lot of young African thinkers, and not just today, but I'm talking about the last, okay, we're in 1928 too. I would say for the last 60, 70, maybe even 80 years, a lot of African thinkers who from a young age, in seeing in when confronted with the cognitive dissonance of hearing a story from the colonizer about them that does not um, conform to their actual lived experience,
Right.
now have to start figuring out how to tell their own story. And so I bring all this up to say that when you pose the question, so what is the attitude about the queen or the royal family, or our cultural relationship, and I mean like at an emotional and psychological level, our cultural relationship with England, and I'll say England to cover, that sort of history. It's one that is quite complex and interwoven with so many, I think, conflicting impulses. Gracie mentioned how the the paradigm that we are brought up with, or at least that our generation up to that point had been brought up with, the paradigm of education and success was very much modeled on the British education system. And so all of what that implies, including admiring successful English examples, was all part of it. Um, and I
Mm.
think there's a Nigerian writer, Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, who once said something to the effect of, "It's not until I came to America that I learned that I was Black." And here's what's interesting about that statement. It's not about being unaware of one's identity. It's suddenly being awakened to the fact that the world sees
Sees you
you
a certain
Mhm.
way.
in a particular
Exactly.
way
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
imposes upon you certain expectations
Standard.
about who you're supposed to be,
Right.
which, in her case, and I think in the case of very many Africans, is so at odds with who they actually are, that really complicates our relationship with the world around us. So number one, our attitude, our if I can presume to speak for some of my fellow Kenyans, is actually quite conflicted and complex. And while what Gracie said earlier about things like respect being paramount, especially respect for authority, respect for figureheads, and especially so because
And the elder.
we
Yeah.
recognize traditional parallels, right? While that does exist, no one can ever erase the actuality of the fact that after Queen Elizabeth was crowned in 1952, um, after she received this news of her father's death, she was on holiday in Kenya at the time. I believe maybe it was she was on holiday with her husband and her young son, and the news arrived to her, and she had to go. And part of her royal duties, the same thing that we see William and Harry before he stepped down were doing, which was to tour the realms or to tour the
Right.
interests of the empire. So in her capacity as princess, that's what she was doing with her young family. And that was in 1952. But what's really curious, it was while she was queen, after she became queen, that a lot of the conflicts, the armed conflicts, the protestations, the freedom
Right.
movements that swept through Africa happened. And the reason why this is important is that the response of the British government to this resistance was
Brutal.
brutal,
Yeah.
was
Yeah. Yeah.
was it was be, the only thing I can think about when I hear the stories of how they treated freedom fighters in Africa, specifically the Mau Mau, is scenes out of TV shows like Game of Thrones come to mind,
Yeah.
where there's a completely unhinged expression of violence against that whom they sought to oppress.
Subjugate. Yeah.
And so in the case of the Mau Mau, it was not simply a question of, and I don't mean to just diminish these people's experience at all. It's just to put it in context. It was not simply a question of imprisoning some political prisoners and
Right. Right.
subjecting them to unhappy conditions or difficult conditions. It was a terror campaign that swept through the middle of Kenya, and especially through the Kikuyu peoples, from whom a lot of these Mau Mau freedom fighters came, and with whom they were associated. But they would go into dwellings and villages and what have you, and they would completely destroy the villages. They would take the people who lived there, men, women, and children, and they would subject them to in the most ungodly, I can't even say inhuman, because these are human beings who are doing this, but the most ungodly kind of desecration of the body. um there's incident reports of British soldiers bringing barbed wire and binding their prisoners from head to toe in barbed wire tightly, and then leaving them out in the sun for days on end.
Right.
And they made a habit of doing this kind of thing. So and doing this while families watched, while mothers and children watched their loved ones desecrated in this way. What the British did is not very different from what Leopold II of Belgium did
So that's what I thought about.
in the Congo,
Well,
which was
what? I'm listening to you, and I think I would really like to have you both or one of you back in February, Black History Month,
Mhm.
because what I'm hearing is it sounds strikingly like what we've had to do
Mm,
as uh,
yes.
African Americans.
Hmm.
And I would be interested to hear more about that parallel.
Oh yeah.
Yes.
It sounds like that you all started your fight, and I heard you say, Grace, that the Civil War rights, not Civil War, the
Mm-hmm.
the rights that we were fighting for kind of kicked off some things across Africa as well.
Absolutely.
Mhm.
But
Absolutely.
I'm hearing at the same time, um, it feels like almost like you all were already on the journey in some sense,
What?
Yes.
and that
Mhm.
you was a little bit ahead of the curve. And I don't, and we don't have time to get into it now because we're gonna have to end this. But I think I would
Mhm.
really like to get into a conversation about that
Sure.
and look at the parallels of those two things.
If I may share something with you, Mark, I think to that end, and maybe this can be something that we can prepare for February. I just published my first novel called Rain in 2020. And it is a book that looks at the experience of what it was to live in East Africa and is to live in East Africa with this fully realized sense of cultural identity that is very, very different from the African American experience, people from whom that cultural identity was forcibly sort of uprooted, right, by the development of during U.S. history. In Kenya, we still have all of our histories, all of our connection to our ancestral home and cultures and what have you. And yet we are also very much a part of the Western world.
Yeah.
And this is not simply just because we were a colony, but because this is this is the way in which the world is moving. We're getting to be a much more cosmopolitan, globalized world. And that you and I can sit here and talk. We're speaking in this shared language with so many shared cultural points, and yet there are
Mhm.
also many cultural details. Gracie and I could start speaking in Luo right now, and that would put us in a completely different place.
Yeah.
But in Rain, I try to tell the story from that perspective, while also looking at the profoundly, I think, toxic effect that these European enterprises that are usually framed as heroic, the toxic effect that they had
Mhm.
on East Africa, on Southern India, in a very immediate way, not just as an abstraction, but through fiction, you get to tell the story of individuals, of individual families. You get to tell the story of subjective experience, of
Mhm.
suffering, of joy, of hope, of despair. And so this is what Rain does. And so if you're willing to consider it, I'd be happy to send you a copy of Rain so you can read it. And then we could have a conversation, maybe using that as a launching platform moving
Okay.
forward, to because again, the characters in Rain are, they parallel our experiences. They were born and raised in East Africa, and yet they've traveled and go out and live in the world, especially in the United States. So they always know where home is, and they're always foreigners abroad. And yet
Mhm.
even at home, because they've assimilated so much of the
Mhm.
American or
Mhm.
European
Yep.
experience, when they come home, they're also they have people see that they're
Foreign.
different. They have an aura of difference about them. So let's share that, and then you can think about it and let me know, because I'd be very
And
happy.
Rain is on Amazon, guys, in case anybody is interested in taking a look at it.
Ah,
It's on
yes,
Amazon.
yes,
Yeah.
yes.
Okay. Well, we'll definitely get together and we'll talk about it.
Sure.
And
Sure.
see when's the next time we could possibly talk and discuss some things. I want to thank both of you for joining. I appreciate it. I'm sorry, everyone, that Catherine was not able to provide video this time around. I know it would have been a little easier to connect with her, but I truly
Yes,
appreciate your voice and
thank you.
all that you shared. Same thing for you, Gracie. Thank you for.
Mhm.
I don't ever feel comfortable calling you Gracie.
Most people call me Gracie. In fact, my new job, everybody calls me Gracie.
Yeah.
So,
And maybe it's because, I mentioned before we got our cat, but our cat name is Gracie.
it's all good. No,
So,
it's all good. That's my spirit animal. No, I'm just kidding.
oh, is it really?
No,
Okay.
no, I'm
So
kidding. I'm
Mark,
kidding.
it just occurred to me, as since we're winding down, that you and some of the other listeners might appreciate something that Trevor Noah had to say about people's response to the Queen's passing. And I think you can find this on his website, but this is
I
one of
actually saw,
those,
I know exactly what you're talking
the
about.
conversation he has after the show, and then
Yes.
publishes it online, where he, in a nutshell, he basically says that, the everyone who has feelings about it, whether it is in favor of idolizing the Queen, or whether it's about criticizing her, um their blood is up. They're all up in arms about it, because they want everybody to agree with their opinions.
Mhm.
And he said that while he can understand why people would want to be respectful of the monarch, and also want to empathize with this family and their loss, he also understands perfectly well how people who've been subjected to the kinds of disgrace that the British Empire subjected its colonies to, why they would not want to participate in that kind of pageantry, why they wouldn't have those kinds of feelings of warmth and compassion. So Trevor's remarks, I think, really capture well
I think,
um,
I
what
think
this,
we
you know, this spirit,
can.
let me just finish, really capture well that spirit of openness that I was trying to allude to at the very, very beginning, because I know that I have complex feelings about it. I know many people that I know also do. And so I'm still walking that path of, at least for me personally, I'm not inclined to share with people how I feel about it. I just know that I know what the history is and I know how I feel about that history.
Right.
I was
Right.
going to say, what's also in terms of, Kathy mentioned pageantry. Much of what some of the, for me, it's always been the case. Some of the, when you look at the wealth and pageantry that as children we really admired. I mean, come on, let's
Mm,
get real. We did.
mm,
We
mm,
admired the concept of a princess, golden this, golden that, chariots. Those were things that were born of the enslavement and the pillaging of countries in
mm,
Africa, in the
mm,
Caribbean, and
mm,
other places, and
Right.
India. I mean, even the we're not even. I mean, the February we'll talk about. I mean, Kathy, we should put it on our little, you know, in our little chart or whatever ticker. You know, just the numbers of Indians that died, so World War II could be funded. You know,
mm, mm,
it's
mm,
mind-boggling, but it's a lot of history that you learn and it informs you moving forward. So as you know, one would say that, you know, oh, why aren't you this militaristic person? No, history informs you so you know exactly how to operate when you're moving forward. That's
Right.
my
mm,
perception.
Right.
And then when you notice things, as we used to discuss in one or two scenarios, you notice when there's that bigotry of low expectations, where it comes from. It's that whole
mm,
colonialistic concept that if a person is brown or black,
mm,
they're therefore less than. And oh, they
mm,
don't really need to earn this much money. Ugh, they're black anyway. They
mm,
could be fine with less money. And oh, they
mm,
can be in this position. They can be just fine. Oh, they don't really need education. You know,
Right.
oh, kind of like the white savior concept. You know, oh, it's just black, so you got to help her out. She's had a hard time. No, I want to work. I want to work
mm,
on my own and get my own. I don't need the pity party concept
Right.
as a
Right.
default. You know, so all of those things are informed by colonialism. All of those things. And racism in America was written by how the British and the French ran their colonies
Yeah.
before they came to America. They have books on this stuff and how to, you know, lessons learned from the colonies they had in the islands, the Sugar Islands, Barbados and Bahamas and all these places. You know, so yeah,
Well, I
good.
think I would look forward to us talking about those type things in the future, and we'll
Okay.
definitely reconnect
Thank you, Mary.
to talk about those things. Um, my friend Patricia goes by
Yeah.
Holy Christ says, "Thank you so much for an enlightening conversation. I appreciate you being on." Hey, Mom, I didn't get
mhm.
a chance to say I love you today, Mom. But glad you was able to join as well. Thank you
Mhm.
all again. I
Thank
appreciate
you all
you
so
so much.
much.
If
Thank
y'all
you
will hold
all.
on just
Thank
for a
you.
few moments. Again, y'all don't be surprised when you see one or both of them back sometime in February, or maybe I have them both back individually because they both have so much to say. Um, that might take up just two Mondays in February right there. So we'll see how that works out, and we got some time to plan about that. Um, Again, thank you all for joining every week. I appreciate you all. The word community has been used a lot of late. And I want you to know that those of you that come on a regular basis and share and things like that, I appreciate you being a part of this community. I truly believe that conversation is what makes the world go better. When we talk to one another, when we listen to one another, we get better understanding from one another. It makes the world better. So I truly appreciate you being a part of this community. Please continue to share conversations. If you haven't liked this page, like the page for me. Follow the page is even better. And if you can write a recommendation about the page, that'd be good as well. All those things help generate more interest, and I really want to just be able to have bigger and better conversations with people from all over the world. And you know that that's been happening a little bit of late. I say it every week. Thank you again. I love you. Yes, there is a new king in Britain, but he will never compare to the King of Kings. Jesus Christ. And if you don't know who Jesus Christ is and what he's all about, I invite you to have a conversation about that. You can certainly leave me a message. You can call the number that had been scrolling across the bottom. You can send something in the chat, anything that you want to do to have that conversation, because that is the most important conversation for you to have from my perspective. And you don't want to miss out on that conversation. All right. And I believe Dr. Catherine said earlier, it does not matter. And she actually talked about Corinthians. It does not matter about all these gifts and talents that you may have been given if you can't do it in love. Okay. If you can't show love, if you don't understand how to get along with your fellow man and woman of this earth, then it's all for nothing. You're just a tinkling brass. You're just making a lot of noise, and sooner or later, noise dissipates, and it's not going to last for anything. All right. So I look forward to seeing you all again real soon, next Monday, 7 o'clock, and just continue to be blessed. Talk to you again real soon. Bye.